Oh no, sometimes I still can't believe the things life throws at you when you least expect them. Before I tell you what happened that evening, let me just say, welcome, my dear friends. I'm so glad you're here with me tonight. Tell me, where are you watching from? I always love hearing it. Florida, Texas, maybe somewhere up north where the sunsets come a little later. And if you enjoy these quiet stories, these little windows into ordinary lives that somehow change everything, don't forget to subscribe and tap that like button. It truly helps me feel we're all gathered here on one big cozy balcony together, watching the world turn gold for a few minutes before night sets in. That evening, the sky was brushed in soft orange and violet, the kind of sunset that makes you stop mid-sentence and breathe a little deeper. I had made myself a cup of tea, chamomile as usual, and stepped out onto my small balcony. It isn't anything fancy, just a narrow strip of concrete overlooking the quiet street below, but it's my favorite place in the world. There's a creaky old chair out there, and a small table that's seen better days. I'd always keep a candle on it, one of those with the scent of sandalwood and rain. I was sitting there, letting the warmth of the cup seep into my palms, when I heard a familiar voice call from next door. It was Michael, my neighbor's son. He had moved back home for a few months after finishing some contract work in Oregon. I'd known him since he was a kid, the kind who'd wave shyly from his bike and always say, "Hi, Mrs. Turner," like he really meant it. Now he was 28, maybe 29. A grown man, taller than I remembered, with that quiet steadiness you sometimes see in people who've lived a little beyond their years. He leaned over the railing from his side, smiling. "Beautiful sunset tonight, huh?" I smiled back. They don't get much better than this. You can almost forget how noisy the world is. He hesitated for a second before asking, "Mind if I join you?" I shrugged, a little amused. "Only if you bring your own chair. Mine barely holds me." A moment later, I heard the soft scrape of metal on concrete as he dragged a chair to the edge of his balcony, just close enough that when he sat down, we could see each other through the vines that trailed between our railings. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and the neighbor's barbecue from 2 houses down. There was something so still about that moment that I almost didn't want to speak. "You always sit out here alone?" he asked after a while. "Most nights," I said. "It's quieter out here than inside. My house feels too big now, too empty." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that. I lived alone for a few years out west, and I didn't think I'd ever get used to the silence. It's strange, isn't it? How you can have so much space and still feel like you're running out of air." His words surprised me. There was an honesty in them that tugged at something I'd buried under layers of routine. I glanced over at him. The fading sunlight caught in his hair, and his eyes looked almost golden for a second. I smiled faintly and said, "You're too young to be thinking like that." He laughed, but it wasn't a carefree sound. "Maybe. But time doesn't always move at the same speed for everyone." We talked for a long while after that, about simple things, the street, the weather, the old oak tree that leaned too far over the fence. But beneath the easy conversation was an undercurrent I couldn't quite name. It wasn't romantic, not really. It was something quieter, something about 2 people, one nearing 60, one barely 30, finding a strange sense of understanding in each other's company. I told him how I'd lost my husband 8 years ago. How, at first, I filled the house with noise, music, television, the sound of dishes clinking, because silence made me ache. He didn't try to comfort me or say the usual polite things. He just listened. His silence felt like a space I could rest in, not one that pressed down on me. When the first evening breeze drifted across the balconies, carrying the faint hum of a radio from somewhere below, he said softly, "I used to come out here when I was a teenager, you know. I'd see you sitting here reading. You always looked peaceful, like you didn't need anyone else around to feel okay." I chuckled quietly. That's funny, because back then, I was constantly worrying about everyone: my husband, my daughter, the bills, the future. Peace was something I faked a lot better than I felt. He smiled, and for a few seconds, we both looked out at the sky, now streaked with deep pinks melting into navy. There was a strange comfort in the shared silence between us. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't filled with expectation. It just was. I realized, sitting there, that I hadn't really been seen in a long time. Not the version of me that cooked dinners and smiled for neighbors, but the real me, the one that sometimes felt tired and a little lost, but still wanted to be part of the world. He looked at me then, not with pity, but with something like recognition. "You know," he said quietly, "you remind me of my mom. Not in the way you might think, but in how you carry things. Like you've got this quiet strength that people overlook because you make it look easy." For some reason, that made my throat tighten. I turned my face slightly toward the horizon so he wouldn't notice. "Maybe that's just what happens when you've lived long enough to see how everything changes," I said softly. He nodded. "Maybe. But it's still beautiful. The way you keep showing up for the world." The sun slipped completely below the rooftops then, and the streetlights flickered on one by one. I felt something shift inside me, a tiny, wordless gratitude. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a woman watching life from the sidelines. I felt present, like the sunset itself had decided to stay a little longer for us. When he finally stood, stretching his arms, he gave me a small nod. "I'll see you tomorrow evening, maybe?" "Maybe," I said, smiling. After he went inside, I sat there for a few more minutes, letting the night settle around me. The candle on the table flickered, its small flame steady against the dark. I thought about how strange it was that a simple moment on a shared balcony could remind me that connection doesn't have to come from grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it's just two people sitting quietly, watching the same sun disappear, and realizing that neither of them is really alone anymore. And as I got up to go back inside, I found myself smiling, not the practiced smile I gave the world, but the real one I hadn't used in years. Something told me that sunset was just the beginning of a story I didn't know I needed. The next evening, the sky was pale and quiet, like it hadn't yet decided what kind of sunset it wanted to be. I didn't plan to go out on the balcony again. I'd had a long day. Laundry, groceries, the small tasks that fill up a life when there's no one else around to share them. But around 6:30, as the light began to soften and that familiar hum of the neighborhood rose up, the clink of dishes, the faint barking of a dog down the street, I found myself drawn back outside. The chair creaked beneath me as I settled into it, a small sigh escaping without me meaning to. I didn't expect to see Michael. Young people have their own lives to lead, and I figured last night had been just one of those fleeting, neighborly moments. Still, when I heard his door open and his low voice call out, "Evening, Mrs. Turner," something warm flickered in my chest. "Evening, Michael," I replied. "You're early tonight." He grinned, resting his elbows on the railing between us. "Didn't want to miss another sky like yesterday's. You make it look like an event, sitting out here with your candle and your tea." I laughed softly. "Well, it's free entertainment. Some people watch television. I watch clouds." He pulled a chair closer again, this time sitting so that our balconies almost felt like one space. He had a bottle of sparkling water in his hand, condensation glistening down its sides. The air carried that faint sweetness of cut grass, and somewhere a radio played a tune from the 70s that made me nostalgic for summers long gone. We talked at first about small things, how his work was going, how his mother was doing, how quiet the neighborhood had become since the Bakers moved away. But as the sky began to bloom into color, the conversation shifted, almost without either of us meaning to. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked suddenly, his eyes fixed on the fading sun. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Life, people. How everything changes, but sometimes you stay the same, and it feels like you're being left behind. His words caught me off guard. I'd thought those kinds of feelings belonged only to people my age, the ones who'd seen more years behind them than ahead. You sound older than you should, I said quietly. He smiled faintly. Maybe I just think too much. When I was out west, I used to hike alone sometimes. Miles and miles, no one around. You start talking to yourself out there, asking questions you can't answer. I nodded, feeling something stir inside me. I know what that's like. After my husband passed, I used to go walking in the evenings, just around the block at first, then farther. It wasn't the walking I needed, it was the space to think without being interrupted. He looked at me then, really looked. Did it help? Some days. Other days, it just reminded me how quiet the world can get. The breeze picked up, stirring the candle flame on my table. I watched it dance, then steady itself again. There was something fragile and brave about that little light. It reminded me of the way people hold on, even when they don't have to. I think, he said after a pause, that's what I've been missing. Someone who understands the quiet. I turned toward him, studying the way the last light brushed across his face. He wasn't a boy anymore, not even close, but there was still something open in his expression, something unguarded. The quiet can be a friend if you let it, I said softly, but it can turn on you if you try to ignore it. He nodded slowly, taking that in. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt different this time, less like distance, more like a shared space. A pair of doves landed on the railing between our balconies, cooing softly as the first star blinked above. I smiled. They come here every evening, I said. I think they've claimed us. Michael chuckled. Then we'd better behave, or they'll report us to the neighbors. That made me laugh, and he laughed too, and the sound blended with the fading music from the radio below. It was such a simple, human moment that it made my chest ache a little. After a while, he asked if I'd ever thought about leaving this place, moving somewhere new. You could have a bigger view, he said, a wider sky. I shook my head. I've had enough wide skies in my life. These few square feet out here, they're enough. It's not the view that matters, it's the peace you find in it. He seemed to consider that, then said quietly, I think you've found more peace than most people twice your age. I smiled, and you've found more questions than most people half mine. The streetlights began to glow again, soft halos of gold against the dusk. Somewhere, a wind chime sang. I felt a strange contentment settle over me, gentle and unexpected. Before he left that night, he stood for a long moment, his hands resting on the railing. Thanks, he said simply. For what? For letting me sit out here with you. You make the world feel slower. I wanted to tell him that he made it feel alive again, that his quiet curiosity had stirred something in me I thought had gone to sleep long ago, but I didn't. Some truths don't need to be spoken out loud. They settle in the air between two people, waiting to be understood. Good night, Michael, I said instead. Good night, Mrs. Turner. He disappeared inside, and I sat for a while longer, watching the shadows lengthen across the street. I realized then that these evenings had become something more than habit. They were a kind of bridge between years, between lives, between two souls who happened to find each other on opposite sides of a narrow balcony. That night, when I went to bed, the air still smelled faintly of jasmine and the memory of laughter. And for the first time in a long while, I dreamed, not of what I'd lost, but of what I might still find. The following evening, I found myself watching the sky long before the sun began to set. It had become a quiet ritual now, one that didn't need planning. I would make my tea, light my candle, and wait for the world to turn gold. I didn't even need to glance at the clock anymore. My body seemed to know when the moment would come. That night, The sky was a wash of deep orange melting into soft lavender. A storm had passed earlier, and everything smelled fresh, like the air itself had been washed clean. The railing still glistened with tiny droplets of rain, catching the last of the daylight. I brushed a few away with my fingers and smiled to myself. The scent of wet concrete and blooming magnolia hung heavy around me. It felt like summer had quietly arrived while no one was looking. Michael appeared just as I knew he would. He carried 2 cups this time, steam curling up from both. "I made tea tonight," he said, grinning. "Chamomile. Thought I'd save you the trouble." "Well, aren't you thoughtful?" I said, taking the cup he handed over the railing. The heat against my palm felt strangely comforting. "You're learning my habits a little too well. Maybe I'm just paying attention." That answer stayed with me longer than it should have. There was something about the way he said it, steady, unpretentious, and sincere. It had been years since anyone had looked at me that way, not as someone's widow, not as the woman next door, but simply as a person worth noticing. We talked, as we always did, about small things first: the rain, the garden, the stray cat that sometimes wandered between our fences. But beneath our easy chatter, something was shifting. There was a softness in his tone that hadn't been there before, a carefulness, as if he didn't want to break the quiet balance we built. At one point, a car passed down the street, its headlights sweeping across both our balconies. For a split second, the light fell on his face, and I noticed the faint shadow under his eyes, the kind that comes from long nights thinking too much. "Rough day?" I asked gently. He hesitated before nodding. "Work stuff. Trying to figure out what's next. It feels like everything's temporary these days. Jobs, places, people." I took a slow sip of my tea. "That's the trick of being young, isn't it? You keep looking for permanence, not realizing it doesn't really exist." He looked at me then, thoughtful. "And when you're older, you learn that change isn't the enemy. It's the only thing that stays." He smiled faintly, and I could see the wheels turning behind his quiet eyes. Then he said, almost under his breath, "I think I came back home to remember that." We sat there in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that isn't heavy but full, like a conversation continuing without words. I found myself watching the way the light played across his hands, how his fingers tapped lightly against the mug, a habit of thoughtfulness. There was something tender about it, something that made me remember how connection doesn't always have to be spoken or defined. The candle flickered as the wind shifted, and I reached to steady it. He noticed and smiled. "You're always trying to protect the flame," he said softly, "even when it doesn't need saving." I laughed quietly. Maybe I just don't like watching things go out. His gaze held mine a moment longer than it should have. That's not a bad way to be. I looked away then, out toward the trees where the shadows deepened. I could feel the warmth rise to my cheeks, and it wasn't just from the tea. It was strange, how time seemed to slow when he was near, how even the air felt different. He began telling me about his childhood, how he used to climb the old maple tree in his yard and watch the sunset from there. "I always wondered what you were thinking when you sat out here," he said. "You seemed so peaceful, like you had secrets the world didn't need to know." I smiled softly. Maybe I did, or maybe I was just trying to listen to the quiet. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "You make the quiet sound like something worth chasing." "Sometimes it is. Sometimes it tells you things you can't hear over the noise." The conversation drifted then, like the clouds overhead, slow, unhurried. We spoke about books, old movies, the kind of music that still makes your chest ache when you hear it. It felt less like talking and more like remembering something together, even if we hadn't lived the same years. When the first drops of rain began to fall again, he stood up, but he didn't move inside. He simply stood there, letting the light drizzle speckle his hair and shoulders. "Feels good," he said. I laughed. you'll catch a cold. Maybe, but it's worth it. Without thinking, I reached my hand out toward the railing between us, palm up. A drop landed right in the center of it, glistening. He looked at my hand, then at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. There was no need to. The air between us was full of rain, of quiet, of something unspoken but understood. Eventually, he said softly, "You ever think about how some people just appear in your life at the exact time you need them?" "All the time," I answered, "though you rarely realize it until later." He nodded, eyes still on mine. Maybe this is one of those times. The rain picked up then, soft but steady, and he finally turned to go inside. "Good night," he said. "Good night, Michael." I watched him disappear through his doorway, and I stayed there a little longer, letting the rain cool my face. The candle finally gave out, its small flame flickering once before it vanished into smoke, but somehow the darkness didn't feel empty. Inside, I left the window open so I could still hear the rain. I thought about what he'd said about people appearing when you need them. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, I found myself wondering if the universe sometimes sends you gentle reminders, not to fall in love, but simply to feel alive again. The next few days passed in a blur of soft evenings and quiet conversations. I'd started to notice small things that hadn't mattered to me before, the way the light fell across the railing in the late afternoon, the way the wind seemed to hum differently just before sunset. Every evening without fail, Michael would appear. Sometimes he brought tea, sometimes a book he'd been reading, sometimes nothing at all. But always, he brought a kind of stillness that the world rarely gives. That night, the air was cooler. Autumn was beginning to slip into the edges of summer, and the leaves had started to dry and whisper in the wind. The sky was painted in pale amber, fading to deep blue, a slow goodbye to the heat of the season. I had made a small pot of mint tea and set out 2 cups before I even thought about it. Habit, I suppose, or maybe something more. When Michael appeared, he didn't speak right away. He just leaned on the railing, looking out at the horizon. I could tell something weighed on his mind, the way his shoulders tensed slightly, the way he kept his gaze fixed on the distance. "Long day?" I asked quietly. He gave a small, tired laugh. "More like a long week. I got an offer from a firm in Denver. Good job, good pay. They want me there by the end of the month." I felt my chest tighten before I could stop it. "Denver," I repeated, trying to sound casual. "That's a big move." "Yeah," he said, turning toward me. "I haven't said yes yet." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The street below was empty, the kind of evening where even the crickets seemed to wait. I could feel the familiar ache of partings, the kind that life teaches you to accept, but never makes easier. "You should go," I said finally, though the words came out softer than I meant them to. "You're young. You can't let small balconies and quiet conversations hold you back." He smiled faintly. It's not the balcony I'd miss. That caught me off guard, and I looked away, pretending to adjust the candle wick. "Michael," I began, then stopped. The words tangled somewhere between reason and feeling. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His voice was enough. "You've been," a kind of calm I didn't know I needed. I didn't expect that. I don't think you did either. I exhaled, a shaky little laugh escaping me. "No, I didn't. I thought I'd built my peace all on my own. Turns out it's easier to keep when someone else is beside you." The candle between us flickered in the soft wind, its flame bowing but never going out. He reached out then, not to touch me, just to steady the candle, the same way I had that first evening. For a second, our hands were close enough that I could feel the warmth from his skin, and that was enough. More than enough. "Maybe that's what this was meant to be," I said quietly. "2 people reminding each other that the world can still be gentle." He looked at me for a long time before nodding. Yeah, gentle. That's the right word. We stayed out there until the last light faded. We talked about Denver, about how the mountains there were taller, the skies wider. He told me he was scared of starting over again, and I told him that fear is the price of growth. It's what makes new beginnings real. When the streetlights finally came on, he stood and took a deep breath. I'll be gone a while, he said softly, but I'll come back to visit. You'll still be here, right? I'll still be here, I said. The balcony isn't going anywhere. He smiled, one of those real, unguarded smiles that reach the eyes, and for a moment I felt something like pride. Not the kind you have for a son or a student, but for another soul finding their way. He turned to go, then paused, resting his hand on the railing. Thank you, he said, for everything you don't even know you did. When he was gone, the space beside me felt impossibly quiet. The tea had gone cold. The candle burned low. I thought about how strange life is, that sometimes the people who make the deepest marks are the ones who only pass through for a short while. Weeks later, after he'd left, I still sat out on that balcony. The chair still creaked, the candle still flickered. But it all felt different now. Not lonely, just changed. I'd catch myself smiling at nothing in particular, thinking of how easily one human connection can shift the way you see the world. One evening, I noticed something tucked under the flower pot on my table, a small folded note. It must have been there for days before I found it. Inside, in his neat handwriting, were only a few words. Keep the light burning. Some things don't fade. I read it 3 times, then set it down beside my teacup. The sun was setting again, painting the world in that same soft gold that started everything. And for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace with what was and what would be. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and whispered to the empty air, "Good night, Michael." The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and rain, and somewhere in the distance, a dove cooed softly. I smiled. Life, I realized, is full of small miracles. You just have to be still long enough to notice them.